Hey everyone, today we're talking about why VR can make you feel sick and how developers try to solve that problem. That and more today on Tiny Voices. Virtual reality has the potential to transport us far away like no other audiovisual medium has before. That potential is so alluring that we've been fiddling with head-mounted virtual reality displays dating back to the Sensorama in the 1960s. In 1995, saw the release of Nintendo's Virtual Boy, which was a major step forward for VR technology in the video game space. Most recently, VR has experienced something of a resurgence with more advanced technology available now than has ever been available before. And it might finally stand a chance at gaining widespread adoption, especially amongst gamers. Major consumer gaming headsets like the HTC Vive, the Oculus Rift, and the PlayStation VR exist now in the hands of consumers, and Microsoft's HoloLens technology looms on the horizon as well. Plus, there are now cheaper phone-based VR experiences like Samsung's Gear VR for the less extreme enthusiast market. There could very well be a bright future ahead for this awesome new technology. In fact, I've done another Tiny Voices episode in the past on the potential horror game applications of VR, but for all of the potential that VR has, there are still a number of hurdles to cross, and one serious hurdle is that it can make some people physically ill. Motion sickness is a feeling of nausea induced by certain types of motion. It can be accompanied by headaches, dizziness, and vomiting, and it's commonly experienced on airplanes, especially during turbulence, inside of moving cars, and on boats being rocked by the wake. The most common theory to explain why this happens is that a disconnect is occurring between different parts of your motion sensing apparatuses, particularly your vestibular system, which includes the inner ear, and your visual system. This is called the cue conflict theory. The way this plays out in virtual reality is that in VR you can visualize movement with your eyes, but your inner ear isn't sensing any change in movement at all. So you get conflicting sensory information on whether or not you're actually moving. And this, it's theorized, is what can lead to feelings of motion sickness. It should be noted that not everyone is equally prone to motion sickness, so experiences which might induce motion sickness in some will be less nauseating for others. Some games are also better about not inducing motion sickness in those prone to it than others. For instance, Driveclub in VR was widely reported as being a source of intense nausea, as was the free-moving PSVR horror title Here They Lie. In fact, the problem for Here They Lie was so widespread that the developers were forced to put out a patch which made the game playable without PSVR entirely. On the other hand, reports of Resident Evil 7 causing similar levels of motion sickness, a game which is also a horror game offering VR users the option to move about freely, seem to be far less prolific. That also seems to be the case for Guerrilla's competitive mech-based first-person shooter, Riggs. Comfort settings are a large difference maker here. Riggs, for instance, offers players a number of options from turn speed reduction to narrowing the field of view, especially during sharp turns. Resident Evil 7 similarly gives you toggles for angled turning, which snaps you left or right 30 degrees at a time, options for field of view, camera acceleration, and a variety of other comfort options, which can be turned on or off at will to control sensations of queasiness while playing. What we also know is that frame rates and input responsiveness play a huge role in mitigating motion sickness, which is why VR games are primarily locked to at least 60 frames per second. Many current VR games are either on rails or only allow you to move freely by teleporting from one location to another. As restrictive as it might be, this also limits your ability to trigger nauseating movements. Ubisoft's Eagle Flight incorporates a great deal of data gleaned from scientific research into their design, and they focused on player comfort during their rigorous playtesting sessions. Motion is always designed to be steady in Eagle Flight. There are no sudden starts or sudden stops. Visual effects are used to give the illusion of quick acceleration, while actual acceleration is limited as you soar through the air. When you risk colliding with a wall, the collision results in a fade to black right before you hit the wall, so as to avoid causing that feeling of illness. David Whittingham of Purdue University found that placing a virtual nose in the lower center of the headset screen was effective in reducing instances of motion sickness by 13.5%. This led to the implementation of the beak in Eagle Flight. It's not just noses either. Fixed reference points like cockpits were found to have similar efficacy. Riggs, for example, places a HUD between the player and the world, and that fixed reference point might be another factor that allows Riggs' highly mobile mechanized combat to work so seamlessly. Another professor, this one from Columbia University, found success with a different approach. Professor Stephen Feiner ran an experiment with a VR experience wherein one group of participants played with a version with limited field of view settings while the other group didn't have that option. The former group reported being able to sustain play in the VR experience for longer with less discomfort than did the latter. I mentioned before that Rigs is a game that offers comfort settings that allow you to adjust the field of view, narrow the aperture during tight turns. And that design decision likely stems from this research. Now, this study, along with Whittinghill's research, is still early and needs to be replicated with larger sample sizes and especially larger control groups, but the early results seem to be promising and offer up a few potential solutions for designing around motion sickness in VR games, at least for the time being. And with the burgeoning VR market, research into solving this problem has been a high priority. So if you want to get into VR, know that motion sickness is a problem to look out for, but it's one that every VR developer is treating very seriously. That's going to do it for today's episode. Next week, we're talking about spoilers. That and more next week on Tiny Voices.